Let me show you a video.
Jesus saves! Jesus saves!
It's the 4th of October 2025, and a group of a few dozen religious activists have marched into Soho, the centre of London's nightlife, wearing outfits which resemble a cross between military uniforms and streetwear. They come to a halt not too far from the Admiral Duncan, one of the capital's oldest gay pubs, and they begin to chant. All of which is immediately undercut in their own video by this guy, who deploys the classic British response to seeing odd behaviour in public, which is to pull a funny face. The activists are members of the King's Army, which describes itself as a non-denominational evangelism movement.
King's Army is an evangelistic army, a coalition of Christians from all walks of life, locking arms together in unity under the banner of our King, to advance the gospel, raising the standard and pushing back darkness as we plunder hell to populate heaven.
Which all sounds very grand. In practice, it ends up looking like a cross between the Cub Scouts and if Baz Luhrmann did Henry V.
We're mobilizing a joint task force made up of every denomination, age, social class, race, and color to play their part in this holy salvation war.
A month later, the King's Army's self-appointed Field Marshal, Scott McNamara, gave an interview to the evangelical magazine Premier Christianity about the demonstration. There, he expressed shock that some people in the secular press and on social media had interpreted the stunt as homophobic. "We don't get caught up in politics," was his carefully chosen line. And look, perhaps their choice of location was merely unfortunate. Perhaps their description of Soho as London's sex district in the caption to the video of the chanting that they uploaded to Facebook was made entirely without judgment. But McNamara's claims that they don't ever get caught up in politics are somewhat undercut by the fact that 2 months previously, the group had organised a protest outside 10 Downing Street and then the Houses of Parliament opposing the legalisation of assisted dying.
House of Lords! Hear the word of the Lord!
Which, I know people's definitions of what does and doesn't count as political vary, but staging a demonstration outside of Parliament demanding that a specific piece of legislation not be passed kind of feels like a slam dunk. If McNamara and the rest of his soldiers deny their loud pronouncements about God are political, however, they're increasingly unique. Over the past couple of years, politics and Christianity have been on an unignorable collision course, not only here in the UK, but in Europe and the US too. Which isn't entirely without precedent. America in particular has had a well-defined and extremely vocal Christian right for decades. What's new is an apparent embrace of Christianity as part of a much broader political strategy. The political right aren't just trying to appeal to Christian voters, they're placing God front and centre of their political messaging for everyone.
This is like an old-time revival, isn't it? An old-time revival.
A cross on wheels is dragged around the Charlie Kirk Memorial Rally in Arizona. A bishop of questionable credentials preaches to an anti-immigration march in London. Peter Thiel delivers a lecture series on the Antichrist. British MP Danny Kruger asserts the inherent Christianness of England in Parliament.
All politics is religious, and in abandoning one religion, we simply create a space for others to move into.
And then there's the conversions. It's not just JD Vance discovering Catholicism or Russell Brand conveniently being baptised just as the allegations drop. Jordan Peterson goes to church now, as does the Bell Curve author Charles Murray. As does, of all people, Joseph Rogan.
Wait, are you going to church too, or is that bullshit?
I have been to church.
Fuck.
Why? Have you ever been to church before?
I've been.
It's actually very nice.
In fact, the real bellwether is the about-face of many new atheists. Richard Dawkins of the God Delusion fame now describes himself as a cultural Christian.
Insofar as Christianity can be seen as a bulwark against Islam, I think it's a very good thing.
Commentators have suggested that at its most virulent, we might be experiencing a rise of Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism.
White Christian nationalism.
The phrase Christian nationalism gets thrown around a lot these days.
But I think that's a bit of a misread. For all the airtime the press has given to oddball priests and pastors from fringe denominations, the reality is that whatever apparently Bible-inspired policies conservatives might be pursuing are the least important and interesting part of any of this. And while the apparent rise of so-called Christian nationalism is surely worrying, there's every chance that conservatives' current decision to cling to the cross is not the sign of political strength, but of political weakness. Look at this photograph. This is a snap of J.D. Vance. It was taken in the Cotswolds in the west of England while the Vice President was visiting the UK this August. In particular, it was taken at a barbecue that he threw. And that this is the only publicly available photo of that barbecue is unfortunate, because the other guy in this picture, Thomas Skinner, is almost completely irrelevant to the topic of rising Christian conservatism in global politics. Worse still, he's such a weird and wonderful character that it kind of breaks my heart to not be able to squeeze in a sidebar in which I tell you everything about him.
One thing I will do, and anyone that knows me will say this, I will give it my best shot. Relax, drink a Stella, you know it make you feel better. You know me, I never, ever, ever look when I put on my gravy, because I'm the absolute governor, of course. He's Tom Skinner, Tom Bosh is Bosh.
Stay strong, Tom. Vance's trip to the UK wasn't an official one. He was here with his family as a private citizen on holiday. But that didn't mean that he wasn't working. It simply means that, outside of a brief carp fishing trip with David Lammy, he was able to snub members of Britain's ruling Labour Party in favour of catching up with fellow travellers on the political right. The most important of these meetings, to my mind, was this barbecue. Because alongside Skinner, Vance had invited two further guests with a little more political and intellectual weight.
I have wrote a speech.
The first is Danny Kruger, a former Conservative MP who has since defected to Nigel Farage's Reform Party.
The Conservative Party is over. Over as a national party. Over as the principal opposition to the left.
In perhaps the funniest case of British nepotism I've come across, he's also the son of Prue Leith from the Great British Bake Off.
Quite often I need 2 holes so that I can squirt.
The final guest that we know about was James Orr. Orr is an associate professor in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, and was recently appointed as a senior advisor to the Reform Party. His greatest influence to date, however, has been as something of a mentor to J.D. Vance during his transformation from Trump explainer and critic to aspiring Trump successor. Politico has described him as Vance's English philosopher king, while Vance himself has apparently called him his British Sherpa. Orr, for his part, has played down this relationship, framing it instead as a journey of mutual intellectual growth.
I think that wildly overstates my influence on Senator Vance. If anything, he has been a mentor to me. We've had wonderful conversations over the years about politics, political philosophy, faith, religion. Senator Vance and I have a sort of kind of camaraderie on trying to work out what the new right should look like in the 21st century.
That question of what the new right should look like is key. It's the beating heart not only of J.D. Vance's relationship with Orr, but of all of these conversations surrounding conservatism and Christianity. Because while it might be the case that the far right has rarely been stronger, Vance and Orr recognise that both the MAGA movement in the US and the ever-ascendant Reform Party in the UK have a problem. Or a couple of problems, actually. The first is that both are cults of personality. There's a reason that Steve Bannon won't shut up about Trump running for a third term as president. Trump is MAGA. There remains hope among the top brass that the baton might be passed to J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, but it's far from certain that Trump's coalition would survive that handover.
I would love to do it. I have my best numbers ever. It's very terrible.
The Reform Party is much the same when it comes to Nigel Farage. A 2024 YouGov poll asked voters what they thought of Lee Anderson, easily the party's second most recognisable MP, and over half of respondents didn't know enough about him to form an opinion. Farage and Trump certainly have strong cults of personality, but neither is scandal-free, and I dread to think what their cholesterol levels are. There's a very real danger that, should anything happen to them, the whole project's just unravel.
Have you heard about the Epstein thing that's going on here?
I have.
You have? What do you think about it?
The second problem is that the success of the right over the past decade or so has been almost exclusively built around being against stuff. What James Orr calls the new right is anti-immigration, it's anti-high taxes, it's anti-free trade, it's anti-welfare spending, it's anti-woke, it's often anti-vaccine. All of that is clear. But if I was to ask you to name something that these movements stand for, you'd probably struggle to name much beyond some vague sense of national pride. All of this is fine in opposition, but as Trump learned from his first stint in office, it's less good when you get into power and find that, while your coalition might have been united in what they don't like, they're divided beyond belief in what they do. James Orr has set himself the task of solving this ideological emptiness and giving clearer shape to the movement.
Not sure quite what to call it. It's not really conservative, it's not really liberal. I suppose it's stitched together by a sense that there is an emerging worldview that is very hostile to some of the kind of foundational assumptions that liberals, conservatives, and indeed I think old school socialists share.
More than just sharing this mission of steering the right towards deeper meaning, Orr, Vance, and Kruger also share a creed. They are all practicing Christians. More than this, they're all Christian converts. In fact, even Thomas Skinner now tweets semi-regularly about going to church, despite previously having had a somewhat different take. There's like a tweet from like 2019. It's like, hey lads, anyone got any good excuses for not going to church with my wife this morning? Which is just like such a... Christian converts are a running theme throughout this attempt to mainstream Christian conservatism. Which isn't something that I say to imply that all such conversions are insincere, although clearly they can be. Either way, there's a reason that people talk about the zeal of the convert. Polling shows us that converts tend to be more observant, more enthusiastic, and more certain of their faith than those who were born into a given religion. In the cases of Vance, Orr, and Kruger, this zeal is perhaps amplified by the fact that all adopted theologies which supported rather than challenged their pre-existing secular experience of the world. Orr and Kruger both come from money and were educated at elite boarding schools. Both then found their way to conservative evangelicalism. Orr found his religious feet at Holy Trinity Brompton, an American-style evangelical church which has accepted millions of pounds worth of donations from GB News owner Paul Marshall, who, because of British nepotism, is also the dad of the ex-bassist from Mumford & Sons.
So it was the middle of wokeness, and you had bought a book online.
Yeah, so I bought a book.
What was the book?
It was Unmasked by Andy No, who's a conservative journalist whose beat is Antifa and the BLM riots.
Even if it was Mein Kampf, it's your right to buy a book.
J.D. Vance experienced his flash of divine light on the road to becoming a Republican candidate, and just so happened to stumble into a school of thought known as Catholic integralism, which, like some Republican voters, believes that society should be organised according to certain aspects of conservative Christian doctrine. Like many converts, all three of these figures are dead certain that everyone else would benefit from similarly embracing Jesus Christ as their Lord and Saviour too. In fact, these three plotters, and many others on the political right, have seemingly come to the conclusion that a certain form of right-wing Christianity might not only be good for converting souls to Christ, but also for converting voters to conservatism. Yeah, so it looks different in this section because we're filming this on a different day, and even weirder, it's going to go back to looking how it did earlier in a minute. Because we forgot to film a section. So I guess we need to talk about Christian nationalism, which is a phrase that you might have heard a lot lately as a way of describing the new Christianized politics of the right. And we could spend a bunch of time doing the classic video essay thing of tracking this ideology and its history and how it differs from country to country, but we're going to make do with the lightest of overviews. Partly because when it comes down to it, I'm not convinced that Christian nationalism is as important a part of this story as we're led to believe. And secondly, because it's just not that hard of a concept to get your head around. At its broadest, Christian nationalism is a belief and practice which, as Encyclopedia Britannica puts it, seeks to create or maintain a legal fusion of Christian religion with a nation's character.
An American Christian nationalist is someone that believes America is a Christian nation and the government ought to keep it that way.
Like in many belief systems, there's a spectrum to this. On the most liberal end of the scale, we have the reasonably neutral observation that a given country, be that the US, the UK, or wherever else, has been shaped in some way by Christianity. This woollier version of Christian nationalism has been bolstered most recently by another convert, The Rest is History host Tom Holland. No, silly, not Spider-Man! Holland returned to Christianity after a nominal childhood church attendance whilst writing his 2019 book, Dominion.
The thesis of the book essentially is that Christianity is the most transformative and revolutionary ideology that has ever existed, and that in its distinctively Western form, it continues to completely saturate the way that people in the West view the world.
This descriptive vision of the relationship between Christianity and a given country's history, however, can quickly morph into a prescriptive one. Britain, or America, or wherever else, should be a Christian country, and the government should either defend or extend the role of the Christian faith in the life of the nation. At its most extreme, we reach the realms of Pastor Doug Wilson, shepherd to a flock of extreme Christian nationalists including Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of War. Wilson believes that US government policy should be shaped entirely by Christian values, or more specifically, his own ultra-conservative theological views, including a rolling back of women's right to vote and a reinstatement of laws against sodomy.
The collectivists who are in power now use the power of the sword to extort money from middle-class working taxpayers in order to redistribute that money to other people who shouldn't be getting it. That's how they use their power. If we had power, we would stop abortionists.
In truth, Christian nationalism is always a deeply conservative Christian nationalism, for two simple reasons. The first is that the nationalism part of the equation just tends to be anathema to liberal Christians, who tend to celebrate coexistence with other religions rather than wanting to win some clash of creeds. The idea of pursuing a politics which actively excludes non-Christians and non-Christian perspectives is likely to horrify. The second is that any Christian nationalist is always going to be driven by the aspects of their theology which explicitly differ from mainstream secular politics. If you're a pro-choice, LGBT-supporting, feminist Christian, there's a vibrant enough current which is supportive of those things within secular politics that you don't necessarily need to channel it through your faith. Christian nationalists almost always attempt to frame their desire to reshape their country's politics around the Bible as a return to some pre-existing state rather than some novel revolution. American Christian nationalists, for example, claim that despite the First Amendment's ironclad ban on the establishment of an official state religion, that America was still founded as a Christian country.
Remember that we were a collection of states and colonies, and you need to read the state constitutions before anything else. 9 out of 13 of the original states required you to be a Bible-believing Christian to serve in government at the time of the founding. 13 out of 13 required a declaration of faith. 9 out of 13 required you to be a Protestant.
Aspiring theocrats in the UK can rejoice in the fact that they're already one step closer to their goal. England already has an official state religion in the Church of England, with bishops in Parliament and 26% of primary schools being affiliated with the church.
Because the Church of England is not some private club, just another eccentric denomination. The Church is the chaplain to the nation, and through the parish system, in which every square inch of England has its local church and its local priest, we are all members, we all belong, even if you never set foot in your church from one year to the next, even if you don't believe in its teachings, it is your church, and you are its member.
Although massive L for conservative Christians lately, as the Church of England is currently preparing to install its first ever female Archbishop of Canterbury.
Settle in as we make sense of the downfall of the United Kingdom and the obliteration of the Church of England through a biblical lens.
To get too caught up in how true these claims to some national Christian continuity are, however, is to somewhat miss the point. I don't mean to pretend that hardcore Christian nationalists like Doug Wilson don't exist, nor that we overlook the various attempts to erode the wall between church and state which are currently ongoing in the US. But these attempts don't entirely feel novel.
So here it is in all its glory, the offending Ten Commandments monument. It's in the surrounding grounds of the Capitol.
What really feels new is the combination of Christianity and Joe Rogan.
I have been to church.
Conservatives are clearly trying to do something new with Christianity. They're trying to use it as a means to extend their coalition. And that attempt to mainstream Christian conservatism, to me, is far more interesting. But why on earth do they think that God might be a winning strategy? To understand the recent increase in religious rhetoric among the right, you have to understand that many Christians across the political spectrum are currently under the impression that there is an ongoing resurgence of Christianity in the West. The roster of high-profile conservatives who have recently converted, they believe, has been accompanied by a new wave of young people who are also finding God.
There is a real revival of religious conviction in our culture, not just our culture, but across the West. It's a real thing. We can officially say that now.
It's a narrative which seems pretty plausible if, like me, you've spent a month researching a video on contemporary Christian politics and now have a TikTok feed peppered with videos of trendy young converts going to church or to Christian music festivals.
When we were worshiping earlier in the tent, I felt like God said so clearly, you are not waiting for a revival, you are living in it now.
The secular press have also gobbled up this tale. I've seen several packages from mainstream news outlets amplifying this idea that going to church is becoming cool again.
We've come to try and put faces to the figures that suggest more and more young people are turning to religion.
When combined with all this chatter about Christian nationalism, the overall effect is to suggest that Christianity is getting both more radical and more popular. In fact, the notion that Christianity is experiencing this big revival works in some ways to legitimize the spike in politicians and political commentators talking about God. They're simply responding to a popular demand.
You know, I've recently become a Christian. That don't mean you have to become a Christian. I mean, it's working for me pretty well. I feel an incredible relief.
And yet, this much reported Christian revival isn't quite what it seems. The biggest spike in stories about this supposed resurgence in the UK came in April 2025, following the publication of polling by the Bible Society, which claimed to have discovered something astounding. Church attendance among young people had absolutely exploded. As recently as 2018, just 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds both described themselves as Christian and went to church at least once a month. Just 6 years later, that number had shot up to 16%. There was a similar jump among 25 to 34-year-olds too. And this trend appeared particularly strong among young men. 21% of British men between the ages of 18 and 24 are apparently now both Christian and attending church at least once a month. That's more than 1 in 5. The Bible Society wrapped all this data up in a 46-page report which they titled The Quiet Revival, which soon became a buzzword in Christian media. That the Bible Society described this revival as quiet, however, is fitting, because every other piece of hard data we have points in precisely the opposite direction. This revival seems to be so quiet as to maybe be non-existent. See, the Bible Society data was what's called self-reported. It relied simply on asking people whether and how often they go to church and trusting their answers, which is pretty normal for polling, but this was kind of unnecessary. The largest Christian denominations in the UK actually collect their own data on church attendance, and they take the somewhat more robust approach of asking vicars or church wardens to actually count how many people are in the room on a given Sunday. When the Church of England published its annual attendance report this October, it noted that whilst attendance was recovering from an understandable dip during COVID, the long-term trajectory of decline simply hasn't been stopped. Ken Eames, the report's author, wrote in no uncertain terms that by almost every measure in almost every diocese, Church of England attendance and participation was still significantly lower in 2024 than in 2018. Data from the Catholic Church is less detailed, but similarly shows a drop in attendance from 702,000 in 2019 to just over 575,000 in 2024. Writing in the academic magazine The Conversation, David Vance further highlights that the Quiet Revival poll findings are contrary to plenty of other polling on the same issue which has been undertaken during this period. It also seems fair to suggest that if 1 in 5 young men have become regular church attenders, that would likely be a phenomenon it would have been impossible not to have noticed. And there just aren't stampedes of young lads marching down the street at 8:45 AM each Sunday morning. Vance pointed to several reasons the poll might have been flawed. He highlighted in particular that respondents to YouGov polls of this type are both self-selecting and are paid for their responses. This can open up the possibility of people just trying to crack through responses rather than giving accurate information. Polling also just isn't a particularly good way of measuring things that people do. Not only are people prone to lying to make themselves sound good, but lying about whether and how often one goes to church is the classic example of something that people choose to lie about.
It's not only that we're going to church services less. Actually, I have to report to you that there's recently been some research by sociologists in which they've checked up the answers to public opinion polls. They've asked people, did you go to church last week? And then they've gone to look in the pew to see whether you actually were there. And I have two disturbing bits of evidence to report to you. First of all, we fib a lot when we're asked that question.
Commentators who would quite like the Quiet Revival narrative to be true have attempted to defend this outlier finding through various means. It's happening entirely in smaller denominations, or vicars are counting wrong. The biggest reach I found was from the authors themselves, who suggested that the new converts might be tuning in via Zoom, but they're all sharing laptops and so are being undercounted that way. Yeah, and if I accounted for all the people who are getting together to watch my YouTube videos in cinemas, I'd probably have bigger numbers than Mr. Beast. The reality is that this uptick in church attendance is most likely just bunk. It simply isn't happening. If this is the case, it mirrors a similar phenomenon in America, where articles celebrating a supposed revival are countered by data which shows that, at best, the proportion of Americans going to Christian churches has stabilized after decades of decline. If the Quiet Revival report has any truth to it, then it doesn't seem to have found that young people, and young men in particular, are going to church more, but simply that they're lying about going to church more. Which might actually be more interesting than if they were actually showing up. See, the comparable data from the US is pretty revealing here. The results of the Pew Research Center's 2023 to 2024 Religious Landscape Study found that 18 to 24-year-old men were now slightly more likely to identify with a religion than women of the same age. This marks a massive turnaround in a country where women have historically felt more compelled to warm the pews on a Sunday morning.
Get up, Homer, it's time for church.
I don't want to go.
Interestingly though, where young men are more likely to describe themselves as religious, they're still less likely to regularly pray or even to say that their professed religion is very important to them. It's important to caveat that the overall trend of both religious identification and church attendance is still one of wholesale decline. If anything notable is taking place at all, it is a tiny bump in the number of young men identifying as Christian, either directly or by lying about going to church. That they're not actually turning up or praying or saying the religion they've adopted is all that important suggests that faith itself isn't all that key to this. Instead, the identification is the goal. In fact, more than simply debunking the part of the Christian nationalist narrative which suggests that an advocacy for religiously informed policymaking is a response to a quiet revival in their faith of choice, all of this actually reveals a lot about why conservatives have become so obsessed with God in the first place. When faced with footage of tracksuit-wearing evangelical Christians marching into Soho, or photos of Vance talking with members of the Reform Party, it can be easy to frame British Christian conservatism as an imported offshoot of the American Christian right. The charismatic, low-church evangelicalism of some of these recent displays, after all, shares far more with American megachurch culture than it does with traditional high-church Toryism.
Hello, I'm Geraldine. Believe you're expecting me.
No, I'm expecting our new vicar. Unless, of course, you are the new vicar and they've landed us with a woman. Some sort of insane joke.
Finally got a clip from the Vicar of Dibley into a video. Wait till I get started on the episode where she has to eat all the Christmas dinners, which I mention all the time. This isn't entirely inaccurate. King's Army Field Marshal Scott McNamara lives in Orlando, Florida. And Holy Trinity Brompton, which is the spiritual home of evangelicalism within the Church of England, was heavily inspired by the Association of Vineyard Churches in the US. And because of British nepotism, the key link is Eleanor Mumford, who is the mum of Marcus Mumford from Mumford & Sons. Usually there's no Mumford & Sons references in my videos, and you know, this one we've had two.
What about 3 if you count my shirt?
Nevertheless, the current attempt to use Christianity to give new meaning to the mainstream political right perhaps has greater origins in Europe than we might like to admit. In 2017, Rogers Brubaker wrote an article in Foreign Affairs outlining the emergence of a new set of rhetorical tropes among populist anti-migrant politicians in Europe. Figures like Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders, he wrote, increasingly positioned themselves as defenders of a Judeo-Christian European civilization rather than only their own national culture. This was despite the fact, he continued, that Europe is the most secular region of the world with extremely low rates of church attendance. Christianity, he argued, wasn't being used out of any particular commitment to the faith itself, but as a locus of cultural identity.
I will never be silenced, and I will never follow in the footsteps of those weak politicians who have opened Europe's borders, who impoverishing and endangering our people, selling out our Judeo-Christian civilization to those who shout the anti-Semitic choruses in our streets today.
Brubaker coined the term Christianism to refer to such uses of Christianity as a political rather than religious vehicle. Christianism, he writes, is a matter of belonging rather than believing, a way of defining us in relation to them. The them which was being rejected by Le Pen and Wilders was Muslim immigrants, and Islamophobia remains a powerful force in the attempt to redress right-wing populism in the clothes of Christianity. This is abundantly clear in Richard Dawkins's about-face. Dawkins didn't start describing himself as a cultural Christian because he'd suddenly found common ground with the Christian church. This is the man who wrote The God Delusion, for crying out loud.
There is something insidious about training children to believe things for which there's no evidence. Merely to say that religion is harmless isn't good enough.
He was actually pretty open that he was mostly motivated by his throbbing Islamophobia.
Insofar as Christianity can be seen as a bulwark against Islam, I think it's a very good thing.
When I began looking into the conversion of right-wing activist Tommy Robinson, it took less than a minute of the first video that I found of him talking about his new faith for him to start complaining about Muslims.
When I watched, it was the Paris Olympics, and the opening ceremony was satanic. And it was a total attack on Christianity and the core beliefs of Christianity and Jesus. It was disgusting. And if someone who wasn't out to defend Christianity at every point, I watched it and just thought, that's done my head in watching that. They would not do that for Islam or Muhammad.
The new apostles of conservative Christianism have added further thems to their list of opponents since 2017.
The left, I call it the radical left. I call it sometimes the radical left lunatics.
Christianists like Le Pen and Wilders used to celebrate the extent to which European Christianity had come to accept certain aspects of progressive change.
Because we know that without our Judeo-Christian civilization, there would be no separation of church and state.
This was contrasted with Islam, which is portrayed as being completely uncompromising and wanting to install Sharia law wherever it goes. The new wave of Christianist nationalists makes no such compromises. Vance, Orb, and others frame secularism as every bit as much the enemy as would the most extreme Islamist imam.
You may just be a card-carrying atheist, but you still will recognize that religion is a real phenomenon in human history. And you'll recognize that actually modernity is engaged in a kind of very large, uncontrolled experiment in seeing how we can get on, large societies can function without the one thing that all human societies up until, in the scheme of human history, 5 minutes ago, had as central.
There's a generous reading of this which sees them as merely mourning the loss of religion in the abstract as a means of community and shared meaning. But it remains Christianity in particular which is being mourned.
Through all these long years, from the time of Alfred to the time of Victoria, it was assumed that a nation was a community of common worship and that our community, this country, worshipped the Christian God. Then in the 20th century, another idea arose, that it is possible for a country to be neutral about God, that the public space, the public square was empty of any metaphysics, that the route to freedom lay through the desert of materialism and individual reason, no hell below us, above us only sky.
Furthermore, Christianist nationalism is conservative Christianist nationalism. Liberal Christianity appears in these conversations as an oxymoron.
My final claim is progressivism and Christianity are at odds.
The result is that the obsession with the UK or the US or wherever else being a Christian nation becomes a roundabout way of declaring that country to be a conservative nation. To not be a conservative is to be in some way other, an enemy within.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
Political enemies are thus instantaneously transformed into national enemies, enemies of the state. And yet, where proponents of the mainstreaming of Christianism really differ from their European forebears is in the renewed focus on the us part of the equation. Conservatives clearly see Christianity as having the potential to give new energy to their movement. At its most basic, the hope is that finding some common mythos might serve as a coagulant to a movement which is hyper-prone to splits and defections.
I'll be resigning from office with my last day being January 5th, 2026. And I look forward to seeing many of you again sometime in the future.
Now, you sort of fell out with Reform UK. I think it was back in early March, towards the end of February, that kind of thing. And one of the problems...
Well, I think correctly, they fell out with me.
The vague suspicion of power which defines the populist right at present might be replaced with something which looks a bit more like an actual ideology. Two recent events which took place this December, one on either side of the Atlantic, demonstrated the potential of this conservative turn to God. The first was the Unite the Kingdom rally, London's largest far-right rally in decades and decades. In a manner which is actually quite rare for the British far-right, Christianity was inescapable.
With every culture, or more or less every culture, a religion is attached to it. With our British culture, it's Christianity. We are a Christian country. We adhere to Christian values, principles, and morals.
People talk about our culture being Christian. They've forgotten that we are constitutionally Christian. What do you think these flags represent? They represent various saints of our country. They are Christian flags. Our national anthem is a Christian hymn.
They've attacked the family, they've attacked Christianity, they've opened the borders.
What a lot of the woke stuff is, it's actually super racist, it's super sexist, and it's often it's anti-religion, but only anti-Christian. Like, why only anti-Christian? That's unfair.
A week later came Charlie Kirk's memorial service in Glendale, Arizona. With a lineup dominated by members of the Trump administration, this was perhaps the clearest template yet of how this Christian nationalist fervor might integrate with state power.
We will defend this world. We will defend goodness. We will defend light. We will defend virtue. You cannot terrify us. You cannot frighten us. You cannot threaten us. Because we are on the side of goodness, we are on the side of God.
So I guess I would just say this gathering and God's presence, God's very obvious presence in this room, the presence of Jesus, is a reminder of what we've known for 2,000 years, which is any attempt to extinguish the light causes it to burn brighter. Every single time.
This is like an old-time revival, isn't it? An old-time revival.
At both events, Christianity, or at least Christianism, was invoked as a source of internal political energy. Not something to be opposed to, but to stand for. It also worked to graft a history onto a populist right which kind of lacks one.
Why did I become a Catholic? I mean, there are all these things that I could point to, but one, I really liked that the Catholic Church was just really old.
As the age of non-committal irony passes and people search for sincerity, all this helps to transform MAGA, the Reform Party, and the various insurgent right-wing parties of Europe from relatively young, unknown entities into the inheritors of a 2,000-year Christian legacy. Passing the baton from Trump to Vance or Farage to whomever should follow him can thereby be framed as less significant than it once did. This appeal to Christianity is an attempt to build something bigger and long-lasting. But whether that's likely to work or not seems less certain. Watching conservatives get excited about the prospect of using Christianity to widen and deepen their coalition it's hard not to see a political faction which is a little bit high on its own supply. Vance and his allies in the US will almost certainly have some success in passing a slate of Christian nationalist policies. And this will be a red rag to the Christian right, who are already besotted with Trump. How much any of this actually appeals to the wider tent which put Trump back in the White House, let alone anyone outside of the MAGA coalition, is another question entirely. Here in Europe, the climb is even steeper. What makes this particular political moment unique is that high-ranking conservatives clearly want to do more than simply co-opt the iconography of Christianity. They want to use actual faith and theology to recharge and sustain their movement. The challenge is that too many of those who they see as potential converts don't really have much interest in the actual substance of the faith, which questions how sustainable any of this is. Maybe Joe Rogan finds God. But if he or any of his listeners are only really popping their heads into church because it's currently on trend for conservatives to do so, it seems unlikely that they're still going to be going in 6 months' time. Others might quickly find that, while they do occupy that slightly woollier end of the Christian nationalist spectrum in which Christianity holds some cultural importance to them, they actually do think that the likes of Doug Wilson or whoever else are pretty nuts. It's easy to view the current collision of Christianity and conservatism across the West as a sign of a political movement at the height of its powers, which is finally able to enact its deepest desires. But there's every chance that what we're actually seeing is a movement which is stalling, playing the greatest hits, and which is about to find out that the deafening chorus that they think is singing along with them is really just in their heads. Perhaps the most egregious overextension of the weirdness of Christian conservatism has been the war on the concept of empathy that Vance and others have been waging. This is something which Lindsay Ellis dug into in her recent 2.5-hour video essay about Trump, Palestine, and Miss Rachel. It was, typically for Lindsay, an absolute banger. What you might not know is that while Lindsay has taken a step back from making videos for YouTube over the past few years, she's still been releasing stuff over on Nebula, the premium streaming service that both of us are a part of. Nebula has a whole catalogue of exclusive and characteristically funny and fascinating videos by Lindsay on everything from Disney flop eras to Guy Fieri, Jurassic Park, and most recently, Bluey adults. As you would expect from the creator who kind of invented the YouTube video essay, they are all absolutely fantastic. Lindsay's exclusive videos are part of a whole catalogue of original content which is only available on Nebula. That includes my debut feature-length film Boomers, which is just over a year old now. There's also Scav, the fantastic new documentary series from the Wendover Productions team. There's Jesse Gender's film Identities. There is so much that it would be impossible to mention it all here. In fact, there is so much great stuff on Nebula now that in the run-up to Christmas, I'm setting you a challenge. We've just launched 3-day free trials, in which you can get a taste of all the stuff which is on the platform. And I want you to go to my link, go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, sign up to a free trial of Nebula, and do your best to try and watch all of it. I will be amazed if you reach the end of those 3 days and don't find yourself sticking around to watch more. And when you do, you are in luck, because if you sign up using my link, go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, you'll get 50% off an annual plan, which brings the cost down to just $3 per month, which is an absolute steal. Alongside being a fantastic package of stuff to watch, signing up to Nebula using my link, go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, really helps to support my work at a time when making videos for the internet is becoming a little bit harder. Not only do we get paid more every time someone watches our videos on Nebula rather than on YouTube, I also get a little kickback when you sign up, which makes a huge difference in allowing us to keep making great videos for you. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you over on Nebula. All that's left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to the people who support us to make videos like this on the top tier over on my Patreon page. who are Richard, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Zoe Alden, Alexander Blank, Neil Tabildgard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Jimmy Dunn, Fiasco Linguini, Agent Maxwell, Glenn Sugden, Emil, Jarabar, Yillamson, Paulius Edicus, Sam Fortunato, and Sanjay Yarsanjeen, and Douglas Urquhart. If you want to join them in getting access to early bits of stuff that we're working on, copies of scripts to the videos, access to my mostly weekly blog, The Friday Update, in which I tell people what I'm working on, and also just to have a definite notification to when we put stuff out, you can find out how to do so over at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thanks so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next video.